So for those of you who haven't met yet, I'm Doug Booker. I am the regional clean air champion for the West Midlands to the northwest of England.
Yeah, and I'm Nat. I work on knowledge exchange activities for the Clean Air Programme, and I'm also a postdoc at Southampton University.
Now, we've had the privilege over the last couple of days to be working with a diverse cohort of ECRs that are involved in different clean air programme investments and projects, which has been really enjoyable for us. And just as a quick reflection before we truly get underway, for me as an ECR, I really hope this is one of the legacies of the programme, that we have brought together this diverse cohort of early career researchers. And from my perspective, it's been extremely beneficial to link up with other ECRs and established researchers.
Yes, both running these events in the mornings, but also having ECRs like co-chairs throughout the sessions. And I'm also on a panel later today to give you the ECR perspective on the directions that we're taking in air quality.
Now, we know that the best way to attract anybody to an event is a free breakfast. So over the past couple of days, whilst you may have been enjoying a coffee in the morning, we've been busy thinking through what the future of air quality research and community is following the Clean Air Programme. So we brought together some 26 different ECRs, including 7 PhDs, 13 postdocs, 1 fellowship, 4 lecturers, and somebody working in public engagement. So as I said, this really diverse cohort to work through these two main areas of what do we want from a future air quality community, particularly from an ECR perspective, but also what are the perspectives of ECRs for the future of air quality research. So these are a couple of pictures of us in action. As I said, it's all very fresh. Now, as Nat has been saying, we had a very important job to do some very rapid qualitative analysis to make sense of some of the noise that came out of the discussions. Some really interesting perspectives, and I've forgotten to say thank you so much for the ECRs who came, but to just really try and tease out the key points that we think will be useful for discussion in this plenary now, but that's also over tea and coffee later. Now, it's probably also worth mentioning, for those of you that were at the dinner last night, you probably have an expectation from Nat and I as members of the Clean Air Programme that we're going to somehow link everything to the letters S and N here. We tried our hardest, but alas, we didn't have time. Perhaps if we'd have had a couple more hours, we would have managed something a bit more comprehensive. So as a starting point, we were really keen to know what existing ECR networks that different members were involved with. And I think you can see it's really quite varied. There are quite a number of different, some, for example, already existing within the Clean Air Programme like Respire and HICAM, but some, and there's many representatives that are covering these different institutions here today. But what we found particularly interesting is that it was so diverse in terms of expertise and background. And I think one of the key messages that came out of the discussions we've had over the past couple of days is that all of these different pre-existing networks are of extreme value, and it's really helpful for ECRs to be able to dip into some of these pre-existing structures, but also there potentially being something which can be perhaps higher level to connect these different networks together, perhaps a network of networks. Somewhat's happening here through the Clean Air Programme, quite frankly, that is being a venue where people involved in clean air, or whether even clean air is the phrase we want to use, but broadly involved in air quality research and action.
And on that, yeah, so one of the things that is really telling across the Clean Air Programme, because we're so multidisciplinary, we could each fit into various niches here, but there's not really a harmonised, unified place for the academic interest of air quality more broadly.
So we started off with a real simple question of what ECRs want from an ECR community, and perhaps some of this is stuff that you've already been thinking about or offering with your colleagues or your students, but hopefully there's some points in here which sort of get you thinking as well. So the first point that came up very strongly was guidance, mentorship, advice to people who are currently in academia for how they can progress in their career, whether that is within academia or going outside. I think it's really especially important in the current academic context where there are so many competing requirements on your time that you get a bit of advice, quite frankly, in terms of how to manage it and where you should be focusing your effort. And the other part of that at the end is how funding works. You know, I've just put in my first big grant application earlier this week, and I had a huge amount of help from my co-Is, who are much more established researchers than I am. And quite frankly, as an ECR, I don't know how you would do it without more established researcher support. So I think it's really important for those that are more established in their careers to get ECRs involved, help them out, because your input is invaluable. The second is, what ECRs wanted was money. Putting together one of these, an event like this, something where there is face-to-face interaction, costs money. It takes time, it takes organisation. I mean, the Clean Air Programme team have done a wonderful job. You need people involved to deliver this. And one of the mechanisms that came up that could do that is some of these other funded projects that are going in with more established researchers and established research teams, they could perhaps apportion some small pots of money within that to host ECR networks or events, which might help some of these conversations that have been established throughout the programme to continue.
And also on projects going forward, people actually putting aside money to do ECR development very specifically, have projects planned, workshops planned, whatever that might be.
And I think it came through very strongly yesterday in Stephen's reflections that there's a real value to the face-to-face networking aspect. There's obviously a place for some hybrid events and online, but the energy that you get from being in the room with a lot of like-minded individuals is particularly impactful, and was something that came up very strongly throughout the discussions.
And we obviously have had 2 ECR breakfast events. We could have kept talking for hours, and we could easily hold more events and keep going.
And I've put this last point almost facetiously of a safe space to ask stupid questions. I think sometimes there's an expectation as you are progressing through your career that you're really trying to establish yourself as someone who is very knowledgeable about their subject, but actually having that venue where you can have a robust exchange of ideas and put out the basics to make sure you're talking a common language is something that was really wanted. And the final point in terms of ECRs wanting for a community is this training and development aspect. So help writing grants. A big point that came up was about communication, outreach, engagement, impact. This has come up so strongly throughout the conference that as academics we really want to be able to communicate our science in a way that is impactful, that is helping affected and deprived communities better their circumstances. So that in itself is a real expertise in terms of how to communicate your science. So advice on doing that as well as things like placements. So what do ECRs want to see from funding calls? The real inter and transdisciplinary as a focus was something that we discussed a lot. And some of the language came up about deep co-production, so actually having the space, time and funding in place to establish sustainable and long-running partnerships with different communities. Because with some of the tighter funding deadlines, sometimes the co-production element is to make it really truly co-produced is quite difficult in terms of timing. As well, looking at the health aspect, really not just thinking about air quality, but also looking more broadly at the air quality and comorbidities to get a fuller picture on health.
Yeah, and from this program, a lot of the PhD students and postdocs that we've developed have been very interdisciplinary, getting too close to that. So we need somewhere for those people to then go. It's all well and good training them, but where is the next step to continue this development as multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary researchers?
And we also got very quickly stuck in the mire of the process of applying for funding. So this was actually thinking about, partly about your dreams for funding. And
we literally asked, what is your dream funding call?
And it very quickly got into the reality. So we did, while we had some of these blue sky thinking ideas, for a lot of ECRs, particularly postdoctoral research associates, it's very difficult to actually know what you can apply for. Some of the processes have been quite challenging, both actually with the funder and within your own institutions to know what you're eligible to apply for. So there was a lot of call for more discussion and thought around how we can actually open up postdocs to be working across different projects, to be applying as PIs on different bits of money. But also we had the idea of it would be really helpful for early career researchers both to have short type funding, whether that's for proof of concept or bridge funding, because many postdocs are in quite precarious positions with short-term contracts, but also some of these longer-term research funding in place for perhaps more fundamental research. So, for example, some people looking at consumer products and VOCs, where there's a very specific inventory that they're looking to build up over time, and quite frankly, that just needs long-term funding.
But with the short term, it was raised, there was a bit of concern that bridging funding would be great, but not at the detriment of there just being another mechanism for people to go, oh, well, just apply for this and just eat yourself out on another piecemeal opportunity. It has a place, but not as another mechanism to keep people back.
So alongside this, there are a few different topics that came up, and I won't read them all out, but you can see it's quite varied. I'll just pick a couple. I mean, oral histories and lived experience, something that people really want to see around air quality, indoor air quality. Emerging pollutants of concern, like ultrafine particles, so more research on that. And there was a massive discussion on indoor air quality in the built environment. It was quite clearly, from my perspective, coming up as one of the main things that ECRs wanted to see from funding calls. And of course, when we talk about indoor air quality in the built environment, that's also linking across different disciplines, including health. So, the final thoughts that we really went through was asking the ECR community what they thought the future of air quality research would be. And it came up very clearly that they thought it's going to be more transdisciplinary, so that's including deep co-production with different publics, with policymakers, with industry. So just making sure that the research that people is doing is really tied into real-world impact, whether that is validating the efficacy of new products, whether it's an air cleaner or an air freshener, or working with a community with really bad air quality to look at what the underlying mechanisms for that poor air quality are.
And stakeholders and policymakers, very evidence-driven grants, obviously giving impartial information, but very clear directions of where this is actually going to go.
And as a big part of that, it was, and this sort of goes back to the training aspect, is making sure that the science we deliver and how we communicate that is considerate of where people currently are in terms of their knowledge, to make sure that, for example, if you're working in a community with poor outdoor air quality, poor indoor air quality, you're giving them advice that's actually going to help make their situation better. You know, if you're telling them the air quality is bad and there's nothing they can do about it, you know, is that particularly going to be making the situation better? Probably not. There's also a lot of thought about looking at the whole air quality system. I think this connects to some of the sort of health and comorbidities research I was mentioning earlier. Really not just isolating air quality as a distinct aspect, but building that into perhaps bigger narratives. And I think it came out yesterday when we were talking about sort of healthy environments or healthy homes, where air quality might be a single part of that. A lot about personalising air pollution, whether that is moving beyond some of the current monitoring and modelling paradigms we have based on indoor and outdoor, but actually thinking about personal exposure, but also personal communication, whether that is, as you might have seen, the sort of Strava app you can get that sees your personal air quality, but also making sure the message of what someone's air quality or air pollution is put in a language that they will understand and actually might lead to them taking action. I've mentioned novel pollutants, also a big call for more open source air quality science, whether that's data sharing, access to current monitoring, really opening up some of the barriers to air quality research at the moment. Increasing focus indoors. What I've not mentioned yet is, I think, a big interest in looking at indoor air quality and energy, that nexus. We're seeing a lot of that at the moment with the net zero movement, and also more with connecting better with health. We also just thought it'd be quite interesting, perhaps we can all reflect on this and seeing, of the current ECRs, who wants to stay in academia. And we had, this is a very scientific poll, we can see of the 20, what did we get? 17 out of 26 or 7.
Well, this one was this morning, and our breakfast was a little bit late, so.
Maybe, so I think we must have lost a few people due to late breakfast. But many of the ECRs currently involved in the Clean Air programme want to stay in academia. 10, one always and one part-time. So I think that's a good news message that a lot of the people in the room do want to stay, haven't been turned off. And some of the reasons for that included they like the autonomy and flexibility and creative freedom-ish. I think as they get more admin duties, perhaps that was probably from some of the lecturers, which I am quickly finding out. Because they're good at it, you know, really taking pride in their work, you know, one of the benefits of what we do as well is an opportunity to learn every day, and it's very curiosity driven, as well as to meet and work with new lovely people. So we had one person who was a no, with no specific reason, and many who were unsure, and some of that is the issues that we're all aware of.
You say some of that. Money and long-term stability, housing stability, that was written many, many times.
Yes. So just to finish up with a little insight into what we looked at this morning, we had a very lovely session from the University of Birmingham Press Office, from Beck Lockwood and Tim Mayer, so thank you very much if you are in the room, looking at everything from press releases to expert comment, which I really think ties into this idea of making sure that we are communicating the science in an effective and responsible way. So really helpful. I think it's been a really good session, and thank you for listening.